June 4, 1943, Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. A line of German soldiers stepped down from a passenger train, not into darkness, not into despair, but into a land blazing with light. Every farmhouse window glowed. Every street corner shone. Every shop window burned with electricity. For men who had lived under blackouts since 1940, it was like stepping onto another planet. They whispered to each other, "The Americans must be lying. No nation at war could live like this." Yet the truth was undeniable, written in the endless lights of Texas. The first cracks in Nazi belief appeared not in battle, but in astonishment. That night was more than a transfer of prisoners. It was the beginning of a collapse, not of armies, but of ideas. These men, veterans of the Desert War, were about to discover that America's real weapon was not only tanks or bombers, but the power to build, to feed, to illuminate. From Liberty ships to Pullman coaches, from factories to farms, every step of their journey would tear apart illusions. What began in Mexia was the first lesson in a new kind of victory. In May of 1943, the Desert War ended in silence. General Jürgen von Arnim, successor to Rommel, surrendered 250,000 men in Tunisia. These were not raw recruits. They were the veterans of the Africa Corps, soldiers who had once driven the British back to the gates of Egypt, men who carried the Iron Cross on their chests and the pride of the Reich in their hearts. To them, captivity seemed temporary. They still believed in ultimate victory, but America was about to dismantle that belief without firing another shot. At the port of Oran, Algeria, the process began. 30,000 prisoners stepped into makeshift camps, expecting chaos, hunger, humiliation. Instead, they were met with precision. American officers photographed and filed identity cards with speed that rivaled an assembly line. Doctors administered full medical examinations and inoculations. Interpreters explained Geneva Convention rights in fluent German as if this moment had been prepared long in advance. For men accustomed to shortages and disorder, the efficiency was disorienting. The first breach in ideology came not from bullets, but from paperwork. Then came the food: white bread, real coffee, meat served twice a day. Obergefreiter Hans Müller wrote later that they thought it was a trick, propaganda dressed up as generosity. They did not yet understand that this was the American standard, not a performance. That first meal at Oran was the beginning of doubt, and doubt was more dangerous to Nazism than defeat in battle. The journey across the Atlantic was supposed to be a grim march into exile. Instead, it became a floating classroom in American power. The prisoners boarded Liberty ships, vessels they had never heard of, but soon realized were miracles of speed and scale. The SS Robert E. Peary, they were told, had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. At first, they dismissed it as exaggeration, but then they learned there were thousands of these ships, 2,710 in total, assembled from parts manufactured in 32 states. Engines built in separate factories, cylinders cast and shipped from towns that had barely existed before the war, all fitted together into working ships at a pace beyond German imagination. For men raised on the myth of German technical superiority, the revelation was devastating. Yet the true shock came in the mess halls. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann later wrote that the crew threw away more food each day than his entire company had received in a week in Africa. Half-eaten steaks, loaves of bread, gallons of milk, all discarded without thought. It was not mockery, it was carelessness, born of abundance. To soldiers hardened by scarcity, this waste was unbearable proof. The United States did not fight a war with its last reserves. It fought with surplus, with more than enough to feed its soldiers, its sailors, and even its prisoners. On the rolling Atlantic waves, Nazi certainty began to rot faster than discarded bread. In August of 1943, the Liberty ships reached Norfolk, Virginia. For the German prisoners, It was their first sight of America itself, and it crushed every image painted by Nazi propaganda. The naval base sprawled across 4,000 acres. Its docks stretched for miles, cranes swung endlessly, and in a single day, the port moved more cargo than Hamburg could manage in a week. One prisoner counted 47 cargo ships at work, each operated with electricity that flowed cleanly, without the coal smoke that choked German industry. In the parking lots, ordinary dock workers drove their own cars. In Germany, private automobiles were the privilege of party officials. Here, even laborers had two, one for work, one for family. But the deepest shock waited in the trains, not cattle cars, not the 40 and 8 wagons used for troops in Europe. Instead, full Pullman coaches, padded seats, dining cars with silver cutlery, observation cars with wide windows. One American guard even apologized for the air conditioning not working properly. Air conditioning for prisoners in the summer of 1943. As the train rolled westward, the disbelief grew. Every small town glowed at midnight, streets lined with neon, shop windows lit as though the war did not exist. Factories roared through the night shifts, their parking lots filled even at 2 in the morning. To men from Hamburg and Munich, where blackouts and hunger ruled, the sight was unbearable. Every mile of track through Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky was another blow to ideology. Soldiers pressed their faces to the glass, watching a nation that lived in constant light, that consumed electricity as if it were infinite. In the diaries they hid, one phrase repeated itself: "This cannot be real." But it was real, and it was only the beginning. As the trains pushed deeper into the American interior, the landscape itself became a lecture on industrial might. In Tennessee, the Alcoa aluminum plant stretched for miles along the river, its furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the prisoners gazed at Rubbertown, 4 massive facilities that had risen from empty fields in just 18 months. Together, they produced 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never reached more than 120,000 tons in its best year. The lesson was brutal. America had taken Germany's science and multiplied it 6 times over. Then came Detroit. From the windows of their Pullman cars, the prisoners saw Willow Run, Ford's giant factory, a city of steel and glass. In only 9 months it had risen from farmland, and by 1943 it was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak, 42,000 workers filled its floor space, assembling aircraft from 1.5 million parts supplied by 1,500 subcontractors. German officers, trained to believe that American machines were inferior, watched with silent dread as row upon row of bombers rolled off the line with precision that rivaled clockwork. Speed, scale, and quality, 3 words that rewrote their entire worldview. Crossing the Mississippi River into St. Louis, they faced yet another revelation. Barges moved below the Eads Bridge, each loaded with more grain than their entire homeland had harvested in a season. Elevators along the banks rose like cathedrals of abundance, holding enough wheat to feed cities for months. For men raised in scarcity, the sight was crushing. In one diary, a young soldier wrote, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, without limit, without fear of loss." The arsenal of democracy was not a slogan. It was a landscape, rolling past train windows, leaving disbelief in its wake. When the trains finally reached Texas, the prisoners expected barbed wire and bare earth. Instead, they entered a world of wooden barracks fitted with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Camp Hearn, built in just 4 months, could house nearly 5,000 men. To soldiers who had grown up in villages without plumbing, it felt less like a prison and more like a town better equipped than their own homes. The hospital astonished the German doctors among them. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, discovered equipment more advanced than most German civilian hospitals possessed: X-ray machines, surgical instruments, and most shocking of all, penicillin. In Germany, it was still whispered about as an experimental miracle. Here in Texas, it was administered freely, even to prisoners with minor infections. For men who had seen comrades die for lack of sulfur drugs, the sight was both miraculous and humiliating. The camp kitchens became classrooms in abundance. Walk-in refrigerators, gas ranges, and automated dishwashers churned out meals for thousands. Regulations required 10% more food than necessary, so that no prisoner ever went hungry. The leftovers, perfectly good bread, meat, and milk, were discarded. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, confessed in his diary, "We threw away more food today than my family has seen in 3 years. I wept as I tossed bread into the garbage. Captivity had turned into revelation. What was meant as containment became a daily lesson. America possessed so much that it could extend comfort even to its enemies." By the autumn of 1943, America faced a labor shortage. Farms needed hands, factories needed workers, and so German prisoners were sent beyond the barbed wire. Trucks carried them across the American heartland, without blindfolds, without secrecy. They saw everything. In Texas, they watched cotton gins powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, machines that processed in 1 hour what entire villages in Germany could not finish in a month. Farmers who were not aristocrats, not party members, lived with running water, tractors, trucks, and even refrigerators. Their workers, including African Americans, ate lunches larger than the weekly rations of German civilians. What struck the prisoners most was not wealth for the few, but comfort for the many. In Nebraska, they labored in sugar beet fields and watched machines harvest with a power that seemed almost cruel. One combine could do the work of 100 men. Fields stretched to the horizon, each one larger than the farms of entire German counties. A farmer's teenage son drove a tractor worth more than everything a Bavarian peasant might earn in a lifetime. To the prisoners, it was as if they had stumbled into another century. Then came the harvest. In Kansas, mountains of wheat filled elevators that towered above the plains, each holding more than Germany imported in a year. In California's Central Valley, they picked fruit by the ton, only to watch it bulldozed into pits because prices had fallen. Perfectly good oranges destroyed, acres of crops plowed under. For men raised in famine and scarcity, the waste was incomprehensible. Some begged to send food home, only to be told it was impossible. One prisoner wrote with despair, "They destroy food to keep balance." In Germany, we destroy lives to keep ideology. It was here, among the wheat fields and orchards, that Nazi certainty crumbled. The propaganda of weakness had collided with the reality of limitless plenty, and lost. For German prisoners accustomed to rigid hierarchies of class, race, and gender, the American factory was a revelation. At the Campbell Soup plant in New Jersey, they saw lines of machinery that processed more tomatoes in a day than German facilities, handled in a month. Elderly men and women oversaw conveyor belts, steam cookers, and automated filling machines. One woman, hair pinned back, calmly monitored controls that managed what 50 German workers would have done by hand. She sipped coffee, listened to a radio, and worked without urgency. The prisoners could only stare. Efficiency here did not come from harsh discipline, but from technology and trust. In New Orleans, they unloaded steel at the Higgins boat factory, where 20,000 workers, including women and African Americans, built 700 landing craft every month. They worked in shifts that never stopped, 24 hours, 7 days a week. What Nazi ideology had condemned as weakness, diversity, democracy, equality, was now revealed as a strength. At Republic Steel in Ohio, blast furnaces consumed endless trains of iron ore and coal, producing 10,000 tons of steel each day. For one German who had worked at Krupp before the war, it was a moment of despair. He admitted in his diary, "They waste more steel in spillage than we can produce with slave labor." Everywhere the prisoners looked, they saw a system that worked because it empowered the many, not the few. America's factories did not hide women and minorities, they elevated them. The lesson was clear, even to the most hardened ideologues. Nazi propaganda had lied, and reality could not be ignored. The most devastating blows to Nazi ideology did not come from factories or farms, but from something far more disarming: kindness. By late 1943, American authorities had begun re-education programs in the prison camps. German prisoners were offered classes in English, mathematics, even democracy itself. Universities like Chicago and Stanford provided materials and lecturers. Thousands enrolled, hungry not only for food, but for knowledge. Camp newspapers, edited by anti-Nazi prisoners, began to change in tone. What started as defiant nationalism shifted into debates about freedom, reconstruction, and economics. Prisoners who once swore loyalty to Hitler now read American newspapers comparing multiple viewpoints, a freedom unimaginable under the Reich. Then came Christmas. Churches and civic groups across the United States sent 500,000 packages to enemy soldiers: cigarettes, candy, toiletries, even handmade cards from Boy Scouts arrived at the barracks. Choirs sang German carols at Camp Hearn. Women baked cookies and cakes for men who had once fought their sons. The prisoners ate turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, pies, and ice cream until they were sick. One wrote with disbelief, "We ate better than our generals, better than our party leaders." And this was their normal Christmas. The message was unmistakable. Nazi propaganda had claimed America was decadent, divided, racially corrupt. Yet here, women and minorities worked side by side. Here, enemies were treated with charity. Here, strength was measured not by cruelty, but by generosity. For German prisoners, the foundations of racial supremacy crumbled. If their enemies could treat them with dignity, what did that say about the lies they had believed? On June 6, 1944, news of the Normandy landings reached the camps. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave. The numbers were staggering, beyond anything German officers had believed possible. Within days, the prisoners watched newsreels showing the invasion, the endless streams of ships, the floating harbors, the convoys pouring supplies across open beaches. In silence, they absorbed the images. The Reich had told them America was weak, incapable of great operations. Yet before their eyes stood proof of an organization and industrial power no European nation could match. For many, it was the final collapse. One prisoner admitted, "We had challenged the greatest power on earth with fairy tales. We sent horses against trucks, rifles against automatic weapons, courage against unlimited resources." From that moment, victory was no longer a question. It was only a matter of time. Even the most loyal Nazis grew quiet. They still loved their homeland, but they no longer spoke of triumph. What had begun in Mexia, Texas, with electric lights, had now reached its climax: the certainty that Germany's cause was lost. For the German prisoners, World War II was no longer a battlefield struggle. It had become a lesson in scale, in production, in democracy's capacity to marshal abundance. The propaganda had died. Reality had won. By the spring of 1945, the German prisoners had undergone a transformation no one could have predicted. At first, they had arrived defiant, convinced of their nation's superiority. But 2 years inside American camps had changed them more deeply than defeat on any battlefield. Medical care was among the most striking. German doctors worked side by side with American staff, learning techniques and using equipment they had never seen before. Men who had suffered untreated wounds in Africa received surgery. Those with mental breakdowns were given counseling instead of punishment. Attempted suicides were met with therapy, not brutality. To soldiers raised under the harsh discipline of the Wehrmacht, this humanity was incomprehensible. One prisoner wrote, "They treated us not as enemies, but as patients. They healed us because we were human, not because we were useful." The classroom expanded as the war neared its end. Over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in courses: English, mathematics, political science. Universities offered correspondence lessons. Camp newspapers published essays about Reconstruction and democracy. Officers who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler began drafting plans for agricultural reform in a post-war Germany. A young physicist wrote of attending lectures by American professors, including Jewish refugees. He marveled that they shared knowledge freely, even with enemies. By 1945, the numbers spoke for themselves. Out of more than 370,000 German prisoners, fewer than 1% attempted escape. 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Many maintained friendships with American families that would last decades. Some fell in love through correspondence. Thousands immigrated to the United States after the war. For those who returned to a broken homeland, the lessons endured. They carried back visions of abundance, efficiency, and dignity. In their words and their actions, they planted the seeds of a new Germany. World War II had destroyed one world, but in the prison camps of America, another was quietly being born. The story of the German prisoners in America is not just a footnote to history. It is proof that the greatest victories are not always won with tanks or bombers, but with abundance and humanity. These men came as enemies, hardened by ideology, certain of their cause. They left transformed, their beliefs broken not by propaganda, but by the undeniable evidence of a society that created more than it destroyed. In the aftermath of World War II, America chose to treat its captives with dignity. It fed them when their own families starved. It gave them education when their leaders offered only lies. It showed them that democracy was not weakness, but strength. The strength to share knowledge, to build prosperity, and to extend mercy even to foes. That choice planted seeds that would grow into the German economic miracle and the Atlantic Alliance. When these men returned home, they carried more than memories. They carried lessons. They had seen farms that could feed nations, factories that never stopped, classrooms open to all. They had seen that freedom created wealth and that justice sustained strength. They had lived the truth that prosperity does not spring from conquest, but from cooperation. And in carrying those lessons back, they helped rebuild a nation from the ashes. World War II was a crucible of destruction, but it was also a moment of revelation. The world learned that cruelty may win battles, but generosity wins peace. The German prisoners themselves said it best. They entered the camps as Nazis and left as students. That transformation, silent, patient, profound, was America's greatest weapon. Today, as we reflect on those years, we must ask ourselves, what legacy will we leave? If the strength of a free society once defeated tyranny, can we honor that legacy by fighting for peace, for justice, for independence, for freedom? Will our children inherit division and silence, or courage and unity? The truth of World War II is still alive in every story of kindness, stronger than hatred, every memory of abundance, stronger than scarcity. And that truth calls to us now, to eliminate fascism, to fight for peace, to fight for national independence, to fight for justice, to fight for freedom. If you believe these lessons matter today as much as they did then, share this story. Leave your voice in the comments, and join us in keeping alive the spirit of a world rebuilt not on conquest, but on compassion.